Hi, everybody. Today I'm here to talk to you about the sociophonetics of video-mediated versus in-person interactions. So we sociolinguists, we typically like to collect speech data from participants by conversational face-to-face interviews. That's not really been possible the past year and a half of the global pandemic. Of course, people have still been talking to each other over the now ubiquitous conferencing platforms like Zoom. And so a lot of us in linguistics have wondered, well, how about we collect our data over Zoom? Now, there's already been some research on data collected by video conferencing software, some of which shows that the phonetic measures you can collect from video conference recordings can actually be kind of fine for research, depending on the strength of your internet connection and what kind of measures you're interested in. As far as the social context of the interview, other work has shown that speakers may not feel particularly uptight or ill at ease in a Zoom context compared to in person. So as far as stylistic shifts due to those kind of formality reasons, maybe those aren't a worry as well. But a concern that we had was, what if there are other things about the Zoom speech environment that might cause adjustments in people's speech? For example, do people use more clear speech when communicating through a video conferencing app? To the extent that people may feel that intelligibility may be compromised in a Zoom context, you might expect them to make some clear speech adjustments. If they are doing such clear speech adjustments, then we as sociolinguists should know about them so we can take them into account when interpreting relevant data. Accordingly, in this study, we're going to compare speech collected from pairs of participants completing a task in person and also over Zoom, and see whether they make clear speech changes in their vowel and stop consonant realizations in the video conferencing condition. So our participants were 30 speakers of Korean living in South Korea in fall 2020 when data collection occurred. These were 15 cohabitating pairs of speakers. We chose to recruit people who already lived together because we didn't want anyone to increase their risk of COVID exposure to participate in our study. Participants were recruited by my co-author, Yoojin Kang, mostly in their 20s and 30s, but we have a few older speakers. 2/3 of the participants are from the North Gyeongsang region, which is where Yoojin is from, but we've also got some speakers from Seoul and from other types of regions. Our pairs of speakers participated in what's known as the diapics task. So this is essentially a spot the differences task. Each person receives a picture depicting a scene on a beach, on a street, on a farm, and the pictures are very similar, but there are 12 kind of small differences. Without looking at each other's picture, the pair has to verbally cooperate to find the differences. So logistically, how did this work? Yoojin obtained consent and some basic demographic information by email from participants after recruitment, then invited both members of the pair to a Zoom meeting. Each signed into the Zoom meeting from the same room in their home, so they were together at the time, but they're each signed on through their own laptop. First, Yoojin made sure that everyone had the equipment they needed for this task, which was one laptop per person and also one device for recording per person, typically a smartphone. Then she provided some instructions about the task and sent each person a packet of diapics pictures that they'd be working with through the Zoom chat window. The pair then did a practice round of diapics using one of the beach scenes. They're instructed to open up their beach one picture, each had one, on their screen and told they would have 5 minutes to work together to find the 12 differences. While doing the task during this practice round, participants were told to mute their Zoom audio and their video until they were done, but to record themselves on their recording device. So essentially, they're doing this face-to-face, referring to the diapics on each of their screens. Once they found all the differences or the 5 minutes were up, Yoojin chimed in to end the round, at which point participants pressed stop on their devices, saved the recordings, and sent it to Yoojin either through a secure box link or via email. This practice round was not analyzed. It was just meant to get people familiar with the task and to ensure that they had their act together with respect to the self-recording. Now, the interesting part is that there were 2 conditions. One, the Zoom condition, took place with each member of the pair in different rooms. So they each retreat to separate rooms of their house, so they're out of earshot with their laptop and their device. And with their Zoom video and audio turned on, because of course that's the only way they can see or hear each other in this context, They complete 3 rounds of diapic scenes by talking over Zoom. In the in-person condition, the 2 members of the pair are in the same room, facing each other with their laptops on a table. Their Zoom is audio and video muted during this task, so very similar to the practice round. And they complete the same sort of task, so a slightly different set of pictures, but a beach scene, a street scene, and a farm scene. Participants record themselves after each round for a total of 6 test recordings and sent them to the box folder or to Yoojin. The ordering of conditions was counterbalanced across pairs, so half the pairs did the Zoom condition first, then in person, the other half had the other ordering. So how was the data sausage made? First, the audio files were converted to WAV, usually from an MP4 format, for later stages of the workflow. That happened in Audacity. The audio was then transcribed by Yoojin for each speaker in Hangul, and the transcripts were segmented and aligned to audio using the Montreal Forced Aligner. Finally, boundaries for vowels and stop consonants, more details about those later, were manually corrected in PROT or added in the case of VOT measurements and extracted via a script. So for this analysis, we're focusing on 2 sets of sounds in Korean, monophthongs and word initial stops. And in the interest of not taxing working memory too much, I'll present all the vowel stuff, the background, the methods, and the results first, and then all the consonants. So Korean has 10 monophthongs defined by height, backness, and rounding, which are laid out in a neat little phonological table right here. Here's a more phonetic, yet still kind of abstract look at the vowel landscape. For many speakers, the mid-front and low-front vowels are merged in spontaneous speech, and of course, the absolute positioning of any of these vowels will vary across speakers. What we want to know is, how might the overall shape of the vowel space change if people are doing clear speech in Zoom contexts? So for vowels, clear speech generally equals more dispersion. We can take this question dimension by dimension, looking first at height. We expect high vowels to be higher, that is, have a lower F1. We expect low vowels to have higher F1, and mid vowels, well, it's sort of a little unclear. Maybe they stay put, maybe they shift around. Turning to backness, a more complex set of potential predictions. We expect background vowels should have a lower F2, that is, be backer. Front unround vowels should have a higher F2. For these non-peripheral kind of marked vowels, the front round and the back unround, it's a little less clear. You might expect a speaker to increase the space between those pairs of front and pairs of back vowels, possibly by emphasizing a rounding of the lips. So maybe those front back vowels move a little back as a result of increased rounding or as a result of increased backness. The back high unround vowel, maybe you see that moving a little more centrally. The central unround vowels, so these this kind of wedge and probably little to no difference in the F2 dimension. So now to our actual data. We extracted single point formant measurements from over 60,000 monophthongs. And after removing just crazy outliers and tokens with durations less than 50 milliseconds, we are left with over 59,000 tokens across the data set. The vowels for each participant were low enough normalized after the outliers were removed. So this plot shows means for each vowel in each condition, just for everybody. So this doesn't control for any other factor, but some possible patterns do jump out. Vowels do seem to be lower in Zoom overall, maybe. Some vowels seem backer in the Zoom context than in the in-person context. Some vowels seem to be pretty stable, unmoving across conditions. But to see where the predictions we made actually hold up, we ran some linear mixed effects models of F1 and F2 in Arbrule, because interpreting interactions in Arbrule output rather than raw R output is my self-care. Models were built for each formant, starting with a random effect per speaker, plus terms for vowel duration, which we expect to influence vowel quality, and relevant vowel features like height or backness, which of course should also influence quality. Then we want to see if there's an effect of condition, and more to the point, an interaction between condition and vowel qualities like height or backness. So starting with height, we found significant effects for duration and main effects of vowel height and condition. So specifically, longer vowels are realized lower, unsurprising, more time to get to your target. Low vowels are lower and high vowels are higher, thank goodness. And overall vowels are lower in the Zoom condition. But the interesting part is that there's an interaction between height and condition, such that in the in-person condition, high vowels are a little lower and mid-low vowels are a little higher. That is, the vowel space is relatively compressed along the height dimension. In the Zoom condition, high vowels are higher and mid and low vowels are lower. That is, the vowel space overall is expanded along the height dimension. Turning to F2, to see what's going on in the backness dimension, we analyzed what we're calling peripheral and non-peripheral vowels separately, and I can say more about that in the question time if you want to hear more about it. Peripheral vowels here are basically the unmarked front unround, back round vowels, the ones that are phonetically on the edges of the space. Again, looking at these vowels, we see main effects of vowel backness and condition, such that back vowels are backer and front vowels are fronter. Vowels overall are backer in the Zoom condition. Interestingly, no significant effects of duration here. But there is an interaction between vowel backness and condition. Similar kinds of effects in the in-person condition. Front vowels are a little backer, back vowels are a little fronter, such that the vowel space is relatively compressed along the backness dimension. In the Zoom condition, front vowels are fronter, back vowels are backer. That is, the vowel space is expanded along the backness dimension. Turning to those marked non-peripheral vowels, these are those front round and back unround vowels for which the predictions were admittedly a little sketchier. We find main effects of duration and vowel, so longer vowels tend to be backer. Front round vowels are fronter, back unround vowels are backer, but there's no interaction with condition and vowel. No matter how I slice up this pie, whether I'm looking at 4 separate vowels or characterizing them by backness or roundness, condition does not interact with vowel or roundness. So to summarize midway, we have evidence for clear speech adjustments over Zoom. There's an expansion of the vowel space in the height and the vowel dimensions, at least for peripheral vowels in the Zoom condition. Now coming to the word initial stops. Korean has a 3-way contrast between word initial fortis, lenis, and aspirated voiceless stops at 3 places of articulation, which are pictured here. Historically, a major cue to this contrast has been VOT, where aspirated stops have a long lag VOT, fortis stops are short lag, and lenis stops are somewhere in between. However, there's a change in progress where the VOT difference between the lenis and the aspirated stops is neutralizing. Instead, the contrast is being cued by F0 on the following vowel. So in terms of what cues people are actually going to enhance in our data, if they do clear speech with respect to consonants, we expect to see lots of interspeaker variability, assuming people may be in different stages of this change. People may choose to enhance one cue over the other. So what do we expect to see in our data? So with respect to VOT, in Zoom context, we might expect the VOT difference between aspirated and lenis stops to increase, meaning longer VOT for aspirated stops and or lower VOT for lenis stops. Fortis stops, a little less sure. They may not vary very much due to floor effects. They've already got a pretty short lag VOT. With respect to pitch on the following vowel, we might expect to see these differences enhanced in Zoom speech, with aspirated stops becoming higher pitched, lenis stops lower pitched, and fortis stops, hard to say, perhaps some pitch lowering to differentiate them from aspirated stops. We extracted VOT measurements and pitch measurements for about 6,600 word initial stops across the 30 participants. VOT was measured in the usual way, from the release of closure of the stop to the onset of periodicity for the following vowel. F0 was measured 20 milliseconds after the onset of periodicity, so near the start of the following vowel. So looking first at VOT, this plot facets out all 30 participants, and you can see a lot of variability in the VOT differences. Some people definitely have that aspirated lenis neutralization going. Some still distinguish those two sets via VOT, though it doesn't really pattern along obvious social lines. So we ran some regressions, and the regression upshots, aspirated stops have the longest VOT, fortis has the lowest VOT, and lenis is intermediate, so that's unsurprising. VOTs in Zoom are slightly longer overall, so that may reflect something about a change in speech rate. Young people have longer VOTs, which is consistent with some other research on age differences in VOT, just generally speaking. But there's no significant manner, or that is stop type and condition interaction. Turning to F0, we again see lots of variability across speakers. Some people using pitch to distinguish stop types, others really probably not. Turning to the outcomes of the modeling, things get a little more interesting. We see various significant main effects and an interaction. Overall effects of stop, manner, and place. Pitch is somewhat higher overall in Zoom than in person. Women have higher pitches than men, unsurprisingly. And then there's an interaction, which is that aspirated and fortis stops have a somewhat lower pitch, while leanness have a somewhat higher pitch in the in-person condition. That is, there's sort of a compression of this pitch space. In the Zoom condition, aspirated and fortis stops have somewhat higher pitch. Leanness stops have somewhat lower pitch, thereby expanding the overall pitch space. It's not perfect because the contrast between aspirated and fortis stops, which are the ones that are closest in pitch in the first place, is not specifically enhanced, but the overall range seems to increase. So to summarize, we started off with this question: is there evidence of clear speech adjustments in Zoom communication compared to in-person interaction? And the answer, at least tentatively, seems to be yes. We see an overall phonetic space expanding in Zoom speech relative to the in-person condition for some measures. For vowels, you have the peripheral vowels getting more peripheral, so a widening along the height dimension and along the back dimension. With stops, we see an expansion of the overall pitch range on the following vowel. Movement of non-peripheral categories, so vowels that are central, or stop categories that are that have a middling pitch to begin with, they are less predictable in their movements if they move at all. So what are the implications for data analysis? Well, I think there's at least some thinking that we have to do with respect to some of the common types of tasks we want to complete in sociophonetics. The application of normalization methods, for instance, especially across mixed data, that is data that may come from in-person interviews and video interviews. If your normalization method relies, for instance, on corner vowels or otherwise the edges of the vowel space, those corners may move in a predictable way across modalities, but the interior of the space may not. So if your normalization method is simply stretching the vowel space, that may introduce some distortions in the interior, which may be not desirable. I think we want to be careful in assessing contrasts. So we all love a merger or distinction, but depending on where your favorite merger or distinction is located, whether it's closer to the edge or somewhere in the interior, it may be enhanced in Zoom speech, or it may not be. Finally, and along similar lines, the assessments of shifts that assume stable reference points may give you a bit of pause. So if your corner reference vowel, say a back oo, is more peripheral than usual in a Zoom context, but your interior vowel that's being compared against it hasn't made a similar sort of adjustment, then if you're taking that measure of, say, fronting, you may overestimate the extent to which a shift has occurred for that speaker. It may not be a problem if you're just doing comparisons across people that all have been collected in the same kind of Zoom context, but you really want to be wary about comparing that kind of data to in-person data. So lots of questions for future research. One, are these findings more or less generalizable across languages, or is it just something about Korean speakers and or the contrast in their language? We do have data from English speakers doing the same tasks. That is to be analyzed, so stay tuned. Are there patterns according to social factors like age, gender, dialect, or even the salience of specific features? The social differentiation among our participants was not really varied enough to be able to look at social factors, but it's something certainly worth looking at, especially because you may see age-related differences in how people treat different cues depending on ongoing changes in progress. The literature suggests that we might expect some different kind of adjustments between women and men. And of course, dialect could also be a relevant factor. We might ask if there are similar effects or bigger effects seen with stranger dyads. We're dealing with people who are very familiar with each other's speech, cohabitating throughout a pandemic. And the need for clear speech adjustments is probably not that great. So we might see similar or even bigger kind of effects if we got strangers together who really felt the need to bridge an initial intelligibility gap. And of course, there's always other fine-grained influences on clear speech effects that we might be able to dig into here with more data and more varied data. Things like the influence of type or token frequency for different variables or even words, the influence of phonological neighborhoods, and so on. So thank you very much. We look forward to your questions.